Vlad the Impaler's name is one that sends chills through the bones of those who dare to speak it. In the 15th century, the land of Wallachia, nestled in the Carpathian Mountains, was a place ruled by fear, a land where cruelty wasn't just a weapon, it was a way of life. Vlad III, known by his ominous title as Vlad the Impaler, became infamous not only for his brutal reign, but for the sheer terror he unleashed upon anyone who stood against him. His methods of punishing enemies, especially the Ottomans, were both horrifying and legendary. He would drive long iron stakes into the ground, impaling victims alive, leaving them to die a slow, agonizing death. These gruesome acts were more than just displays of power. They were a terrifying signal to his foes, a reminder of the reach and wrath of his rule. His cruelty, however, didn't stop at the battlefield. Vlad was known to invite enemies into his court under the guise of peace talks, only to seize them, torture them, and kill them in the most barbaric ways imaginable. The stories of his merciless treatment spread like wildfire, and the name Vlad the Impaler quickly became synonymous with suffering and death. Yet, while his reign was brutal and his methods terrifying, there was a method to his madness. Vlad's reign was plagued by political intrigue, betrayal, and constant threats from both internal and external forces. He ruled during a time when Wallachia was a pawn caught between the powerful Ottoman Empire to the east and the Hungarian kingdom to the west, both of whom sought control over his lands. It was within this dangerous environment that Vlad learned to rule with iron cruelty. He saw his enemies not as adversaries to be reasoned with, but as obstacles to be removed at any cost. His cruelty was, in his mind, a necessary measure to ensure his survival and the stability of his kingdom. Vlad's reign became a mix of brutal efficiency and paranoid cruelty. His behaviour sparked fear among his subjects, but his kingdom, though harsh, remained relatively intact while many of his enemies fell, and yet this very brutality would become his curse. Over time, the bloodshed he wrought would grow into something more than just a reign of terror. It would transform into something darker, something that would outlast his earthly life. People began to whisper that he wasn't merely a man, that he was something beyond mortal comprehension, a being touched by dark forces. It was these whispers, born from the horrors of his reign, that would eventually fuse with the world of myth, giving rise to the legend of Dracula. It was in this crucible of terror and mysticism that Vlad the Impaler's name would be forever etched into the history of the world, forever bound to the mythic, the supernatural, and the eternal fear that continues to haunt the imaginations of all who dare to delve into his story. Vlad's name, Vlad the Impaler, carries with it a sinister weight, one that has become more than just a historical title. It is a mark of a man who embodied fear, death, and darkness. But how did a young prince come to wield such a dreadful moniker? Born in the year 1376, Vlad III was the son of Vlad the Dracula, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a knightly order dedicated to fighting the Ottoman Empire and protecting Christianity. This connection to the Order of the Dragon would forever shape his identity, for it was in this environment of military and political turmoil that Vlad learned the brutal ways of war and power. Raised in the crucible of conflict, young Vlad was surrounded by bloodshed, betrayal, and political intrigue. His father's decision to enter the order made Vlad a target in the dangerous game of European politics. In a time when loyalty was a fragile thing, the younger Vlad was thrust into the very heart of the struggle for control over Wallachia, a region perpetually caught between the Ottoman and Hungarian empires. Vlad's first taste of terror came early in his life. His father was betrayed by his allies, and Vlad, along with his younger brother, was taken hostage by the Ottomans to ensure their father's compliance. The horrors of captivity left deep scars on Vlad's psyche, and it was in those dark years of imprisonment that he began to see the world not in shades of grey, but in stark, brutal terms. Survival demanded cruelty. After his release, Vlad's fate would take a fateful turn. With his father's death, he ascended to the throne of Wallachia, and it was here that he began to earn his name. He didn't rule with mercy. He ruled with the iron fist of fear, a ruler who knew no compassion for those who stood in his way. His methods were extreme, even by the standards of the time, and it was in his relentless campaign against his enemies that the full terror of his name began to take shape. Stories of his impaling of criminals, traitors, and even entire families began to spread across the region, and with each execution, his reputation grew. The infamous act of impalement, which would become his trademark, was not just a brutal method of execution, but a chilling psychological weapon, sending a clear message to anyone who dared oppose him. Defy me, and you will suffer an agonizing, humiliating death. But why impalement? Vlad was not just interested in inflicting death. He sought to instill a terror that would last long after his enemies' bodies were gone. The sight of a forest of stakes, each one impaling a victim, writhing in agony, was a sight that would haunt anyone who laid eyes upon it, a reminder of the unrelenting power of the man who ordered it. This horrific display of power became so deeply associated with Vlad that his very name, Vlad Tepes, came to mean the Impaler, a title that struck fear into the hearts of all who heard it. The more he used his methods to instill fear, the more his name began to take on a mythic quality, whispered in every corner of Europe. The origins of Vlad the Impaler's name are not just rooted in his bloody deeds. They are a reflection of the terrifying way he chose to wield power. His name was not just a title, it was a weapon. The land of Wallachia, the realm ruled by Vlad the Impaler, was a kingdom caught between two unstoppable forces, the Ottoman Empire to the south and the Hungarian kingdom to the west. Vlad's reign did not emerge in a vacuum. He inherited a kingdom marred by conflict, betrayal, and a precarious balance of power. The Wallachian kingdom, nestled in the harsh mountainous landscapes of the Carpathians, was a land where survival was not guaranteed, and every ruler needed to be as cunning as they were ruthless to maintain control. Vlad's father, Vlad the Impaler, had tried to secure Wallachia's independence by playing both sides, aligning with the Ottoman Empire while also seeking the protection of Hungary. But in this deadly game of political chess, alliances shifted like sand. Vlad the Impaler's efforts to maintain autonomy ultimately failed, as he was betrayed by his own nobles and assassinated. This betrayal would become one of the central catalysts of Vlad III's reign. The young prince, having endured years of captivity in the Ottoman Empire, returned to Wallachia determined to avenge his father's death and restore his family's control. With Wallachia's nobility fractured, Vlad began to consolidate power, relying on terror as much as diplomacy to subdue both his enemies within and those on the borders. The Ottoman Empire, under the reign of Sultan Mehmed II, was an ever-present threat. The Ottomans, with their vast, expanding empire, sought to control the entire Balkan region, and Wallachia, strategically located on the border between the Ottoman and Hungarian realms, was an important prize. Vlad, having been raised within the shadow of the Ottomans, saw them not just as political adversaries but as enemies to be destroyed. His personal vendetta against the Ottomans was driven not just by the memory of his captivity, but by the larger vision of Wallachia's future. His methods of dealing with them were brutal, from ambushing Ottoman forces to executing their emissaries in the most horrific of ways. His cruelty became the very language of his rule, and his enemies learned quickly that they could not underestimate his resolve. But the Ottomans were not his only concern. Within his own borders, Vlad faced opposition from rebellious nobles who saw his iron-fisted rule as a threat to their power. The boyars, the noble families of Wallachia, were entrenched in their privileges, and many viewed Vlad's uncompromising tactics as a challenge to their wealth and status. But Vlad, seeing these nobles as traitors and obstacles to his vision, responded with a vengeance. He began to eliminate them one by one, using their own wealth and lands as rewards for his loyal supporters. It wasn't just the Ottomans or the boyars who fell to his cruelty. Vlad's enemies range from distant neighbouring kingdoms to the internal conspirators who sought to overthrow him. In this climate of constant warfare and treachery, Vlad's kingdom, despite its size and wealth, was continually under siege. The once proud kingdom of Wallachia was now a chessboard on which the lives of thousands were used as pawns in a game of survival. It was in this brutal context, with enemies lurking on all sides, that Vlad the Impaler's reign truly began to take shape. He was not simply a ruler, he was a force of nature, a man shaped by the relentless violence of his world. His kingdom was a reflection of his soul, torn apart by forces that sought to destroy him, yet fiercely holding on to its existence with unrelenting violence. As Vlad stood at the crossroads between two empires, one of darkness and blood, he made a vow. He would not simply survive, he would carve his name into history, and in the process he would become a legend. Want to dive deeper into the mysterious world of Vlad the Impaler and Dracula? Hit the subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and don't miss our next journey into the shadows of history. Explore the legends that shaped our nightmares. Subscribe now. Vlad the Impaler's reign was not merely one of territorial conquest or dynastic ambition. It was a display of unchecked terror, a tyrant's method of maintaining power through fear, cruelty, and brutality. In Wallachia, Vlad reigned with an iron fist, asserting dominance over his people and enemies alike. His rule was built upon a foundation of extreme violence, a violence that was as much a psychological weapon as it was a physical one. The common people, as well as nobles and foreign emissaries, feared his name above all others, for Vlad did not just kill his enemies, he sought to break their spirits, to leave a legacy of despair so potent that it would live on long after the blood had dried. His primary tool of terror, impalement, became his signature, a gruesome act that he wielded not only to execute his enemies, but to send a clear, irreversible message: cross me, and you will suffer a fate far worse than death. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, were impaled during his reign, and the sight of forests of stakes with the bodies of the impaled victims became a symbol of Vlad's unyielding power. The terrifying spectacle of impalement, the slow and agonizing death, was not a random act of cruelty. It was an organized form of punishment, an art that Vlad perfected. His victims would often remain impaled for days, slowly perishing from the unimaginable pain, their bodies left as grotesque warnings to anyone who dared challenge his authority. Yet, even in his cruelty, Vlad saw himself as a defender of his people. He viewed the violence as necessary to protect Wallachia from both external invaders and internal traitors. The Ottoman Empire, with its eyes fixed on the Balkans, sought to expand its reach, and Vlad's defence of his kingdom became a matter of life and death. To him, the bloodshed was a strategic and vital form of defence, one that would ensure Wallachia's survival in a hostile world. But there was more to Vlad's rule than simply protecting his land. He went beyond the normal brutality expected of a medieval ruler. While other leaders may have been feared for their military might, Vlad instilled terror into every level of society. He punished those who betrayed him, or even appeared disloyal, with horrifying methods, his cruelty far surpassing the expected retribution of the time. This brutality extended not only to foreign invaders, but also to his own people, from peasants to nobles. The boyars, the ruling class, were subjected to his wrath just as mercilessly as his enemies. He believed in creating a ruling order based on fear, an order that could not be challenged, no matter the cost. While many saw Vlad's reign as a descent into madness, he viewed it as a necessary evil to preserve his kingdom. He thought of himself as a man bound to protect his people, even if that meant committing acts so horrific that they would become the stuff of legend. His terror, fueled by paranoia and a deep-seated belief in the fragile nature of power, was a constant presence in the lives of his subjects. The legacy of his tyrannical reign would become ingrained in the collective memory of Europe. Rumours spread far and wide, and stories of Vlad's bloodthirsty reign reached the ears of the West, gradually transforming the real Vlad the Impaler into something darker, more mythical, and more terrifying than the man ever was in life. His reign was not just about cruelty, it was the creation of a myth that would echo for centuries, a myth that would intertwine with the very idea of Dracula, the immortal vampire feared and remembered long after his time. The whispers of Vlad the Impaler's cruelty spread like wildfire across Europe, but it was the blood-soaked tales of his inhumane acts that truly cemented his place in the annals of legend. While his reign was one of tyranny, his actions would eventually transcend the realm of political and military rule, transforming him into the very embodiment of evil. The brutal impaling of thousands, not just enemies, but even innocents, left an indelible mark on the collective imagination. It wasn't long before stories began to take shape around Vlad, blending fact with fiction, and the man who once ruled Wallachia would soon be intertwined with something far more sinister, a creature of the night, a vampire. Tales of Vlad's bloodthirsty reign were told and retold, each retelling adding layers to the myth. The gruesome acts of impalement became more fantastical with each whisper, until the prince himself was no longer seen as merely a man but a monstrous figure, something both human and supernatural. His thirst for blood was no longer confined to the battlefield. Now, it seemed, he craved it for his own, as if he were cursed with an eternal hunger. It was through these terrifying stories, told in dimly lit taverns and whispered in the dark corners of Europe, that the seeds of the Dracula legend were sown. While Vlad's actions were horrifyingly real, they gave rise to a far darker entity, the vampire. No longer was he simply a tyrant. He was now a creature that rose from the dead, whose thirst for blood was insatiable, whose power and cruelty had no bounds. The connection between Vlad and the vampire legend began to take shape, fueled by the unrelenting violence of his reign and the way the common people viewed his actions. In the minds of those who had heard the stories, Vlad became a figure not bound by mortal limitations, but one who defied death, a creature who could live forever, haunting the night and preying on the innocent. The story of Vlad, twisted and exaggerated over the centuries, would eventually be immortalized in the most iconic vampire tale of them all, Dracula. It was Bram Stoker, in his novel published in 1897, who would forever link the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler to the fictional creature of the vampire. But while Stoker's Dracula took great liberties with the truth, his creation would serve as the final touch to solidify Vlad's transformation from a bloodthirsty ruler to an immortal monster. The connection was undeniable. Vlad's reputation for cruelty was so deeply ingrained in European folklore that Stoker used it as the basis for his terrifying vampire. In this new form, Dracula became the ultimate symbol of terror, a figure that transcended time and became the archetype for all future depictions of vampires in literature and film. The transformation of Vlad the Impaler into Count Dracula was not just a cultural evolution, it was a mythological metamorphosis. It represented the blurring of the line between reality and legend, between the historical man and the monstrous creature. As Stoker's Dracula became more widely known, it wasn't just the name that stuck, it was the image of a creature forever trapped in the night, a predator whose power and thirst for blood were limitless. Thus, the legend of Vlad the Impaler grew, not just as the story of a tyrant, but as the tale of a creature who had transcended human boundaries, becoming a living nightmare that would haunt the world for centuries to come. As the tales of Vlad the Impaler's brutal reign spread across Europe, they began to evolve, transforming from real events into something darker, more supernatural. Vlad's name, once whispered as a warning of his ruthless rule, soon became synonymous with the very essence of horror. The blood-soaked stories of his reign with impalement as the centerpiece of his cruelty, began to bleed into the realm of folklore, giving birth to the terrifying figure of the vampire. His grotesque acts of violence, particularly his infamous method of impaling his enemies, were no longer seen simply as the actions of a tyrant. They were the acts of something far more sinister. It wasn't just the gruesome image of his victims impaled on stakes that gave rise to the myth, but the way in which Vlad's cruelty seemed to transcend the mortal realm. The horror of his actions became so exaggerated that it began to seem as if Vlad himself had a thirst for blood, an insatiable desire for human life that went beyond simple warfare and political power. The people of Europe, particularly in the regions closest to Wallachia, began to tell stories of a man who could not be killed, whose bloodlust was unending, and who came to represent a force beyond human comprehension. It was in these tales, warped by the fear and superstition of the time, that the figure of Dracula, the vampire, took root. The association between Vlad and the vampire myth grew stronger over time, fueled by the public's fascination with the monstrous and the supernatural. As stories of Vlad's cruelty were passed down through generations, the man himself became more myth than man, and his very name became a symbol of terror. The concept of immortality became intertwined with his image, for what could be more terrifying than a man who could not die, whose thirst for blood could never be quenched? The very idea of the vampire, a creature that feeds on the life force of others, a being that transcends death, found its inspiration in the blood-soaked history of Vlad the Impaler. While Vlad was known for his brutality in life, his connection to the vampire myth made him immortal in a different way. The vampire, as imagined by folklore, was a creature of the night, a predator that lived off the living, and in this sense Vlad's legacy was forever transformed. As time went on, the story of Vlad became intertwined with the story of the vampire, and the two became inseparable. It was in the dark corners of Europe, where superstition and fear thrived, that the first inklings of the modern vampire myth began to take shape. The people who lived under the shadow of Vlad's cruelty began to see his legacy not just as a historical fact, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the terrifying possibility that some men, once corrupted by violence, could transcend mortality itself. This transformation of Vlad the Impaler into the figure of Dracula marked the birth of the vampire myth. It was through the exaggeration of Vlad's bloodthirsty acts, fueled by fear and superstition, that the image of the vampire came to life, forever tying the historical figure of Vlad to the supernatural creature that would haunt the world for centuries. The legend of Dracula was born, and with it the terrifying idea that evil could live forever. The legend of Vlad the Impaler had grown in both scope and terror, becoming intertwined with the very fabric of European folklore. But it was not until the late 19th century that Vlad's horrifying legacy would be immortalized in a work of fiction that would forever link his name to the concept of the vampire. In 1897, the Irish author Bram Stoker published his iconic novel Dracula, a tale that would shape the image of the vampire for generations to come. Though the character of Count Dracula was a product of Stoker's imagination, the dark and bloody history of Vlad the Impaler provided the foundation for the character's creation. Stoker, while not writing a historical biography of Vlad, drew heavily on the mythos surrounding the notorious ruler to craft the vampire that would come to define horror literature. The connections between Vlad and Stoker's Dracula are not merely thematic, but deeply rooted in the symbolism of power, blood, and terror. In Stoker's novel, Dracula is portrayed as an immortal creature, one whose lust for blood and power are limitless, attributes that closely mirror the darkest aspects of Vlad's rule. Just as Vlad used impalement to instill terror in his enemies, the vampire Dracula thrives on fear and violence, feeding on the life force of his victims in a way that transcends death itself. Moreover, Dracula's infamous castle in Transylvania, which Stoker vividly describes in his novel, draws direct inspiration from the eerie and desolate landscape of Vlad's homeland. Stoker's depiction of Dracula as a monstrous figure with supernatural abilities that allow him to shapeshift and control his victims mirrors the larger-than-life myth that had grown around Vlad the Impaler over the centuries. The transformation of Vlad into Count Dracula is not just a literal one, but a metaphorical shift from tyrant to eternal supernatural force. In Stoker's Dracula, the character of the vampire is a blend of both history and myth, with Vlad's blood-soaked reign providing the historical backbone to Dracula's monstrous existence. But Stoker took liberties with the truth. While Vlad was indeed a ruthless ruler, he was not the vampire that Dracula would become. The vampire in Stoker's work is more than a reflection of Vlad's cruelty. He is a figure of darkness and seduction, an immortal predator who transcends the horrors of the human world. Stoker's creation of Count Dracula represents a fusion of the historical Vlad with the broader vampire mythology that had been developing for centuries. Dracula becomes a creature of night and legend, one who evokes both fear and fascination. As Stoker's novel grew in popularity, it became the blueprint for modern vampire fiction. In this way, the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler was forever linked to the fictional character of Dracula, creating a lasting cultural legacy that would inspire countless adaptations, films, and books. The vampire Count Dracula, as imagined by Stoker, would go on to become the definitive image of the vampire in popular culture, cementing Vlad's transformation from a medieval tyrant to a creature of eternal darkness. Through Stoker's work, the bloodthirsty and terrifying legacy of Vlad the Impaler was reborn in the realm of myth, making him a figure whose story would transcend history and live on in the hearts and minds of people around the world. As the legend of Vlad the Impaler continued to grow, something more than just a fearsome ruler emerged from the fog of history, a figure who transcended time and became an immortal symbol of terror. The name Dracula was no longer just a title. It had become a living nightmare, a symbol of dark power that would echo throughout the ages. While Vlad's reign was marked by bloodshed and brutality, it was his transformation into a mythic creature that forever solidified his place in the collective consciousness. The vampire, a creature of the night, one who feasts on the blood of the living, came to embody not just the cruelty of Vlad's actions, but the very essence of terror. The sight of Vlad's impaled victims had already struck horror into the hearts of his enemies, but the legend of Dracula would extend that fear beyond any historical boundary. Through folklore, literature, and ultimately through Bram Stoker's iconic novel, Dracula was no longer merely a ruler who instilled fear. He became the embodiment of evil itself, an eternal predator who lurked in the shadows of humanity's collective nightmare. His image, once a king who commanded an army of fear, transformed into a symbol that transcended nations and eras. Dracula, as an immortal being, represented a fear of the unknown, of things beyond human control. The power that Vlad wielded during his life, the ability to instill terror in both his enemies and his people, was magnified by his metamorphosis into the vampire. No longer confined to the realms of reality, Dracula became a supernatural being capable of bending the laws of nature, feeding on the blood of the living while remaining untouched by the passage of time. This shift from mortal man to eternal monster created a fear that could not be extinguished, as Dracula became a symbol of something far worse than tyranny. He became a representation of the dark eternal forces that lie beyond human understanding. The vampire myth, now tied inseparably to Vlad's name, grew over time, taking root in the deepest corners of folklore and culture. As the years passed, the fear surrounding Vlad evolved from the terror of a cruel prince to the widespread dread of a creature who was not only invincible, but eternally hungry. This fear of immortality, of an unending cycle of violence and bloodshed, resonated with generations, making Dracula an unyielding symbol of evil. The terrifying legacy of Vlad was no longer just a historical fact. It was a living, breathing myth that continued to haunt those who dared to speak his name. The name Dracula would go on to represent a dark archetype in literature and popular culture, the vampire who could not die, who could not be reasoned with, and who could never be defeated. As the decades turned to centuries, Dracula's influence expanded. He was no longer just a historical figure but a cultural icon, one that became a metaphor for absolute power, the corruption that comes with it, and the darkness that lies at the heart of humanity. His name, once associated with a land and a time-long past, now symbolized an eternal fear that still grips the world today. Vlad's legacy, transformed into the mythic creature of Dracula, would remain an enduring symbol of fear, immortalized in stories and in the minds of generations to come. The legend of Vlad the Impaler evolved far beyond the confines of Wallachia and the realms of political history. Over time, his bloody reign became ingrained in European folklore, gradually transforming him into a figure of universal fear. His name, once whispered by those in the Balkans as a symbol of cruel authority, soon became synonymous with evil itself, a monstrous figure lurking in the shadows of history. As his reign ended, the stories of his cruelty did not fade. They continued to spread across borders, twisting into the very fabric of European superstition. Vlad's story was no longer just about a brutal ruler. It became a warning, a tale of what happens when power is wielded without mercy, a cautionary myth about unchecked authority and the terrifying consequences it has on both the ruler and the ruled. These stories, passed down through generations, began to take on a life of their own, each retelling exaggerating the horrors he inflicted and deepening the association between Vlad and the supernatural. The impaled bodies, once an actual form of punishment, became symbols of something darker, something eternal. Over time, these grisly displays of power gave rise to tales of vampirism, stories in which Vlad was not merely a man but a creature of the night, cursed to roam the earth forever, feeding on the blood of the living. His cruelty, his insatiable thirst for control, began to blur the line between the human and the monstrous. In this folklore, Vlad was transformed into a figure whose bloodlust could not be quenched, a figure whose reach extended beyond the mortal realm. This shift from tyrant to vampire became the cornerstone of his myth, perpetuating the idea that there were beings so evil that they were beyond death itself. These stories permeated the collective consciousness, especially as European populations living in fear of war, plague, and famine sought explanations for the darkness they saw around them. Vlad's story, a real-life nightmare, was woven into the fabric of European folklore, where the lines between fact and fiction blurred. What was once a prince of terror became an immortal demon whose name was spoken in hushed tones, a warning of the dangers that could arise from the abuse of power. And so, Vlad the Impaler was no longer just a historical figure, he became the embodiment of pure evil. As generations passed, the myth evolved, taking on new forms, adapting to the changing fears and superstitions of the people. In the wake of his death, Vlad's image was distorted into something far more monstrous than the man ever was. The vampire myths, fueled by the tales of his cruelty, began to spread throughout Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, where the legend of Dracula took root. These myths didn't just make Vlad a symbol of terror, they made him eternal. He had become not just a figure of history, but a figure of nightmare, a creature whose story would never fade. As the centuries wore on, the tale of Vlad the Impaler became a permanent fixture in the folklore of not just the Balkans, but all of Europe. He had transformed from a man who lived and died into a symbol of darkness, a force of evil that transcended time, place, and mortality. This enduring myth, nourished by superstition, fear, and the need to explain the unexplainable, ensured that Vlad the Impaler's name would live on, not as a historical figure, but as a creature of myth, an eternal vampire forever haunted by the blood of his victims. Transylvania, a region shrouded in mystery, darkness, and legends, became the perfect setting for the myth of Dracula to flourish. The name itself evokes images of misty forests, towering mountains, and ancient castles, each stone imbued with centuries of history. It is in this hauntingly beautiful land, nestled deep in the heart of the Carpathian Mountains, that the connection between Vlad the Impaler and the supernatural grew stronger. While Vlad himself ruled in Wallachia, it was the fearsome reputation of his reign, combined with the region's eerie landscapes, that transformed Transylvania into the birthplace of Dracula's legend. One of the most enduring images to emerge from the folklore surrounding Vlad was his supposed connection to Bran Castle, a fortress perched high above the landscape, its jagged walls standing in stark contrast to the rolling hills below. Bran Castle, with its Gothic spires and labyrinthine corridors, became the symbol of Dracula's abode, a dark, ominous place where the vampire could retreat from the light and stalk the shadows. Though there is little evidence that Vlad the Impaler ever set foot in the castle, the eerie connection was solidified in the public's mind, largely due to the atmospheric portrayal of Dracula's lair in Bram Stoker's Dracula. The castle's imposing structure, perched like a watchful guardian over the Transylvanian countryside, seemed the perfect home for a creature of the night. Its history was filled with bloodshed, intrigue, and mystery, perfectly suited to the terrifying figure of Dracula. Over the centuries, the castle, with its mist-shrouded towers and dark chambers, became a magnet for tales of supernatural activity, with rumours circulating that it was not just a fortress, but a place of evil steeped in the blood of both man and beast. Even today, visitors to Bran Castle feel the weight of its dark past pressing down upon them, the sense that something, or someone, might still be lurking in the shadows. While Vlad the Impaler's true connection to the castle remains tenuous, the landscape of Transylvania itself became a character in the mythos of Dracula. The thick forests, dark caves, and high peaks, often hidden beneath blankets of fog, provided the perfect backdrop for tales of vampires, ghosts, and otherworldly creatures. The isolation of the land, combined with its history of war, plague, and fear, added to the supernatural atmosphere that hung over the region like a heavy veil. Transylvania became synonymous with darkness, and the myth of Dracula, born from Vlad's blood-soaked reign, found fertile ground in this land of myth and mystery. The vampire Dracula, as created by Stoker, became inseparable from the image of Transylvania itself, a land of eternal night where death lurked around every corner. As the years went on, the story of Dracula's connection to Transylvania became deeply rooted in both historical and literary tradition, forever intertwining Vlad the Impaler's brutal legacy with the region's dark, haunted image. The land, with its haunted castle and terrifying history, became not only a symbol of Dracula's power, but also of his immortality, a place where the vampire could live on forever, a creature bound to the shadows of time. Vlad the Impaler's reign, built upon bloodshed and brutality, was not just a tale of tyranny and violence, but also one of moral paradox, a story where the lines between good and evil blurred into something far darker. As his name spread across Europe, he was no longer just a cruel ruler. He became a symbol of a deeper struggle, one that pitted the forces of good against the forces of evil in a battle for the soul of humanity. The very notion of Vlad as a figure of ultimate evil, this seemingly immortal embodiment of darkness, fueled the creation of the eternal narrative that still lingers in our minds today. In folklore, good and evil are not abstract concepts. They are tangible forces that often take human form in the shape of tyrants and heroes, saviours and monsters. Vlad, with his unyielding thirst for power, his brutal methods, and his apparent indifference to suffering became the quintessential symbol of evil in the eyes of the people. His actions were a dark reflection of the corrupting influence of unchecked authority, the moral decay that can arise when a ruler views his subjects not as people to be governed, but as objects to be controlled. In contrast, the forces of good were represented by those who opposed him, by the noble resistance of the Christian West, by the forces that fought against his cruelty, and by those who sought to bring justice to the land. But this simplistic dichotomy between good and evil, hero and villain, is complicated by the very nature of Vlad's reign. For while his cruelty made him a symbol of evil in the eyes of many, he also viewed himself as a defender of Wallachia and its people, even at the cost of committing unspeakable atrocities. In his mind, his actions were not evil, they were necessary. He believed that only through terror could he protect his land from the ever-encroaching threat of the Ottoman Empire, from internal conspiracies, and from the fractured nobility that undermined his authority. To Vlad, his violence was a means of survival, a way to ensure that Wallachia would not fall into the hands of invaders or traitors. Thus, in his eyes, he was a hero of sorts, standing between the forces of darkness and his people, a grim and tortured protector whose methods were as extreme as the threat he faced. This moral complexity gave rise to the mythic battle between good and evil that would shape the Dracula legend. It was no longer just a story of a tyrant's rise and fall. It became the story of a man, driven by fear and desperation, who became so consumed by his own darkness that he transcended the human realm entirely, becoming something more than a man, a figure of pure terror who could not be destroyed. The battle between good and evil, as it pertains to Vlad, is not just a story of conflict between opposing forces. It is a reflection of the internal struggle that lies within all of us. It is the tale of a man who, in seeking to protect what he loved, lost himself to the very darkness he sought to defeat. This mythic battle between good and evil, represented by Vlad's brutal reign and the growing legend of Dracula, would echo through history, shaping not only how we view the past, but also how we understand the eternal struggle between light and darkness within us all. The Dracula legend, born from the blood-soaked history of Vlad the Impaler, has not only endured but evolved into a global cultural phenomenon, one that continues to capture the imagination of millions, even centuries after its conception. The image of Count Dracula, an immortal creature of darkness, has transcended the original historical figure of Vlad, becoming a universal symbol of fear, seduction, and the supernatural. Bram Stoker's Dracula introduced this archetype to the world, blending the terror of Vlad's real-life reign with the allure and danger of the vampire. But it was only the beginning of a much larger, ever-expanding mythos. Stoker's creation became the template for the modern vampire, influencing countless adaptations, retellings, and reinterpretations across literature, film, and television. Dracula was no longer just a man. He was a creature of legend, a symbol of the eternal battle between life and death, humanity and monstrosity. His popularity, however, can be traced not only to the sheer horror he represents, but also to the deep cultural and psychological appeal he holds. The vampire, as personified by Dracula, represents our most primal fears: death, the loss of agency, the consuming darkness that waits beyond the grave. But Dracula is also a figure of forbidden desire, a predator whose magnetic power attracts even as it repels. This duality, terror and lure, is what has made the Dracula legend so enduring. Over time, the image of Dracula has adapted to reflect the shifting cultural anxieties of each era. In the early 20th century, Dracula embodied the fear of foreign invaders, of the unknown, of the corrupting influence of the other. The Count's invasion of England in Stoker's novel echoed the real-world anxieties of the time, as imperial powers clashed and cultures mixed. As the world changed, so too did Dracula's role in popular culture. By the mid-20th century, Dracula became a figure not of foreign threat but of individualism and personal freedom, especially in the context of the countercultural movements of the time. In modern portrayals, Dracula is often depicted as a tragic anti-hero, a creature caught between the desire for redemption and the compulsion to consume, adding layers of complexity to his character. This transformation reflects changing societal values and the growing fascination with characters who straddle the line between good and evil, light and darkness. The enduring popularity of the Dracula legend is also tied to the broader appeal of vampire mythology. The vampire as a symbol of immortality and the eternal struggle with human frailty resonates deeply with audiences. The fear of death, of our inevitable mortality, is one of humanity's oldest and most persistent fears. Dracula's ability to live forever, to defy the natural order of life and death, makes him a figure of fascination. But beyond the fear and seduction, the Dracula legend is also about power, political, social, and personal. Dracula, both as Vlad and as Stoker's fictional creation, embodies the dark side of human ambition, the lengths to which one will go to maintain control, and the moral cost of absolute power. In this sense, Dracula becomes a mirror for the darkest aspects of human nature, a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of power and the consequences of losing one's humanity in the pursuit of immortality. The Dracula legend, born from the brutal history of Vlad the Impaler, has morphed into something far greater, a myth that reflects our deepest fears, desires, and questions about life, death, and the human soul. Through countless adaptations, the legend of Dracula has endured, evolving with the times, yet always retaining its power to captivate and terrify. As the legend of Vlad the Impaler continued to evolve, his transformation from a ruthless ruler to the vampire Dracula became an inevitable consequence of his dark history. Vlad's reign was marked by brutality and bloodshed, but the myths surrounding him gradually added a supernatural layer, blending the real and the fantastical. It was his violent acts, particularly his infamous use of impalement, that laid the groundwork for the transformation of his character into something darker, more monstrous, and ultimately supernatural. The people who lived under the shadow of Vlad's reign began to see him not just as a tyrant, but as a being touched by dark forces, a creature beyond the normal constraints of mortality. The cruelty of his reign, which bordered on the supernatural, made it almost inevitable that legends would emerge about Vlad being more than just a man, a figure who could not be killed, whose thirst for blood could never be sated. His transformation into a vampire was not just a cultural evolution. It was a blending of the man with the myth, the historical figure with the legend, until they became inseparable. The image of Vlad became that of a creature whose power transcended the human realm. Over time, the stories of Vlad's cruelty spread beyond the borders of Wallachia, growing in intensity as they moved across Europe. As these stories travelled, they began to take on more fantastical elements. The horrors Vlad inflicted, once viewed as the actions of a brutal ruler, became the foundation for something far darker, a supernatural creature who fed on the blood of the living. The idea that Vlad, with his insatiable thirst for blood and his unyielding reign of terror, had become a vampire was a natural progression in the collective imagination. His violence, which seemed to defy human decency, became the very thing that would elevate him into the realm of the supernatural. The vampire, in folklore, was a being that existed outside the natural order, an immortal creature cursed to roam the earth, eternally hungry for blood. Vlad, with his bloodthirsty reputation and his ability to survive the most gruesome acts of violence, seemed to embody the very essence of the vampire myth. It wasn't just the physical acts of brutality that made him a candidate for such a transformation. It was the very nature of his reign. Vlad ruled with such an iron grip, with such complete dominance over life and death, that he became the embodiment of power, that could not be contained by mortal bounds. His cruelty turned into something beyond human understanding, something immortal, something that could not die. As stories of Vlad's actions spread, they became twisted into something far darker, a creature who could never be killed, whose bloodlust could never be satisfied. This supernatural influence, this transformation into a vampire, was not just about Vlad's physical existence. It was about the legacy he left behind, a legacy that blurred the lines between man and monster. The myth of Dracula, born from Vlad's reign, became a symbol of immortality, of the ability to defy death itself, and of the terrifying consequences of a soul consumed by power and bloodshed. Vlad's story, once confined to the pages of history, became an eternal one, transformed by myth into a tale of supernatural horror that still resonates today. Vlad the Impaler's transformation into Count Dracula is the pivotal moment where history and myth collide, where a historical figure, defined by terror and bloodshed, evolves into an immortal legend, a figure who transcends time and becomes a symbol of eternal fear. This transformation, however, wasn't an instantaneous change. It was the culmination of centuries of storytelling, fueled by the horrifying acts committed during Vlad's reign, which turned him from a ruthless tyrant into the very embodiment of darkness and immortality. It began with the stories. Vlad's reign, marred by his violent acts, his penchant for impaling his enemies, his slaughter of entire families, became fodder for rumours, exaggerations, and fantastical tales. These stories, passed down through generations, began to take on a life of their own, growing larger with each retelling, until the figure of Vlad was no longer just a historical ruler, but a mythic, supernatural creature. His actions were no longer just the brutal acts of a warlord. They were seen as the work of a vampire, a being who thrived on fear, blood, and the power to live beyond the mortal realm. The transition from Vlad to Dracula was not just a shift in identity, it was the rise of a powerful symbol. Vlad's cruelty, his ruthless, bloodthirsty tactics, served as the perfect foundation for the vampire archetype. His cruelty was seen not merely as human violence but as something more primal, more insatiable, something that could only be satisfied by the lifeblood of others. This was no longer the story of a man, it was the birth of a supernatural entity. The legend of Dracula, as created by Bram Stoker in his novel, cemented Vlad's transformation into a creature of the night. While Stoker's Count Dracula was a fictional creation, the character drew heavily on the monstrous traits attributed to Vlad the Impaler, reimagining him as a creature not bound by mortality, cursed to roam the earth in search of blood. The figure of Dracula as a vampire became the perfect synthesis of Vlad's reign and the supernatural mythology that had grown around him. Dracula, in Stoker's telling, was a being who had defied death itself. In this retelling, Vlad's transformation into a vampire was not merely symbolic, it was a literal death and rebirth, an evolution from a man to a creature of endless night. The transformation from Vlad to Dracula reflects a deeper psychological shift as well. The man who once ruled through fear and violence was now a symbol of the fear that would never die, a figure whose cruelty had morphed into something unearthly, eternal. This shift also reflects a cultural fascination with immortality, with the concept of living forever, untouched by time and beyond the reach of death. Vlad's transformation into Dracula symbolizes the fear and allure of immortality, his thirst for blood not only sustaining him, but making him a symbol of timeless power. This metamorphosis from tyrant to eternal creature is what has allowed the Dracula legend to endure through centuries. It has given birth to countless stories, films, and interpretations, all of which continue to shape and define the image of Dracula, transforming him from a man who once ruled Wallachia into a global icon of terror and desire. Dracula as a symbol is not merely a figure of bloodlust and terror, but also one of power, control, and the eternal struggle between life and death. His legend, born from the historical brutality of Vlad the Impaler, has evolved into something far greater, a universal representation of the dark side of human nature, the seductive and terrifying allure of absolute power. Blood in vampire mythology is not just a sustenance for life, it is a symbol of control, of dominance over others. For Dracula, the act of feeding was not only a physical necessity, but also a means of asserting his will over those he preyed upon. His thirst for blood transcends mere hunger. It becomes a metaphor for the insatiable drive for power and dominance. The more he consumes, the more powerful he becomes, feeding on both the life force and the fear of his victims. In this way, the vampire, particularly Dracula, embodies a terrifying aspect of human psychology. The desire for control and immortality, a desire that drives men to commit acts of cruelty, violence, and even madness in their pursuit of power. The fear that Dracula instills is not just a result of his monstrous appearance or the fact that he drinks the blood of the living. It is the fear of his ability to control life and death, to dominate the will of others, and to remain forever untouchable, impervious to the passage of time. He is both the ultimate predator and the ultimate ruler, a figure who transcends the ordinary limits of mortality and becomes a representation of total, undying authority. But with this power comes a deeper, more sinister element of fear, the fear of the loss of one's autonomy. In many ways, Dracula is not only a reflection of the fear of death, but also of the fear of losing control, of becoming subjugated to a force greater than oneself. His victims, once bitten, are no longer in control of their lives. They are slaves to his will, mere vessels for his power. This theme of control, of domination through fear, is central to the vampire mythos and is what makes Dracula so universally terrifying. His immortality, which should be a gift, becomes a curse, a never-ending existence in which he is both ruler and prisoner of his own desires. His power to instill fear, to bend others to his will, makes him not only a figure of horror, but one of tragic loneliness, trapped in an eternal cycle of consumption and emptiness. Dracula, as a symbol, becomes a representation of the dark side of human nature, the desire to control, to dominate, and to never let go. His thirst for blood becomes a metaphor for our own insatiable desires, for the things we seek to possess, the power we crave, and the lengths to which we will go to achieve it. Yet, in the process, we lose ourselves, just as Dracula has lost his humanity in his quest for immortality. His power, born from fear and blood, is his curse and his strength, and in the end, it is what makes him both the most terrifying and tragic figure in all of horror. Dracula, the vampire, embodies the eternal struggle between the desire for power and the inevitable price that comes with it, eternal fear, eternal hunger, and eternal loss. Vlad the Impaler, the man and the myth, existed in a constant tension between his humanity and the monstrous persona that would come to define him. At his core, Vlad was a prince, a ruler who inherited a kingdom beset by conflict, violence, and betrayal. As a young man, he had been a hostage to the Ottomans, forced into a world of treachery and suffering that shaped his views on power and survival. His early life, marked by imprisonment and manipulation, would influence his future actions. Vlad was a product of his environment, an environment where loyalty was fleeting and power was often gained through brutality. Yet, despite the undeniable monstrosity of his reign, there were moments in which his human side surfaced. His efforts to defend Wallachia from the advancing Ottoman Empire, his desire to protect his kingdom and his people, are sometimes overlooked when the focus is solely on his acts of cruelty. Vlad, despite his violent methods, viewed himself as a protector, someone who believed that through fear and bloodshed he could secure the future of his people. To him, his actions were justified as necessary evils, for he believed that the survival of Wallachia depended on his ability to instill fear in his enemies. In his eyes, the impalement of his enemies was not just a brutal act. It was a strategic weapon in his battle to maintain power and independence. He didn't see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a warrior, fighting an unrelenting and merciless war on multiple fronts. His ruthless tactics were, in his mind, a means to an end, a way to protect his kingdom from destruction. But as the years passed, the line between the man and the monster began to blur. The cruelty that Vlad used to ensure his survival slowly began to define him, overshadowing any trace of humanity that may have remained. His acts of violence became legendary, and his name, once associated with royalty and power, was now synonymous with horror. The very traits that allowed him to survive in a world of constant betrayal, the cold calculation, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of power, now painted him as a figure of terror. The same violence that protected Wallachia also turned Vlad into a tyrant, a man whose name became feared not only by his enemies, but also by his own people. This transformation from prince to monster was a slow, inevitable process. The more ruthless he became, the more detached he became from his humanity, until the man known as Vlad the Impaler was replaced by the myth of Dracula. The man who once fought for the survival of his kingdom became a figure of nightmare, one whose insatiable thirst for blood mirrored the darkness that had overtaken his soul. Vlad's duality, the prince who sought to protect his people, and the monster who revelled in their fear, became the foundation of the Dracula legend. This complex, multifaceted character, torn between his human desires and monstrous actions, is what makes the story of Vlad the Impaler so haunting and tragic. It's a reminder of the fragile line between hero and villain, between the man who seeks to protect and the monster who loses himself in the process. The figure of Dracula, born from the dark history of Vlad the Impaler, has long since evolved beyond the boundaries of folklore and literature into a global cultural icon, one whose influence stretches across centuries and continents. This transformation from a 15th century ruler into an immortal symbol of terror and allure began with Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, but it did not stop there. Stoker's portrayal of the vampire Count Dracula, while rooted in the brutal legacy of Vlad, expanded the character into a universal figure that transcended time and place. The impact of Dracula on popular culture is nothing short of revolutionary, shaping the way the world perceives vampires, the supernatural, and even human nature itself. Over time, Dracula morphed from the embodiment of a historical tyrant into a multifaceted character, one who represents not only the fear of death and the unknown, but also the seductive pull of immortality. The idea of a creature who could live forever, untouchable by time and death, spoke to humanity's deepest desires and fears. Dracula's character tapped into something far more primal than mere horror. It played on the fears of power, control, and the loss of identity, themes that resonate across different cultures and time periods. As the legend of Dracula grew, it was adapted and reinterpreted by generations of writers, filmmakers, and artists. From the silent films of the early 20th century, with actors like Bela Lugosi forever cementing the image of the suave, charismatic vampire, to the more modern depictions in movies like Interview with the Vampire and Twilight, Dracula became a character who could evolve with society's changing fears, fantasies, and values. Each new adaptation of Dracula brought with it new layers to the character, whether as a tragic anti-hero, a symbol of forbidden desire, or a dark, monstrous force. Dracula's popularity in popular culture also speaks to his versatility. He is as terrifying as he is seductive, a creature that blends the darkest aspects of human nature with supernatural power. The duality of Dracula, his ability to instill fear while simultaneously luring victims into his grip, has made him the archetype for all subsequent depictions of vampires. His immortality, his control over life and death, and his unquenchable thirst for blood have become central motifs in vampire fiction, and these themes have been re-explored in countless ways across different genres. From gothic horror to psychological thrillers, from dark fantasies to modern action-packed dramas, Dracula's image has morphed and adapted to fit the sensibilities of each new generation. But beyond the countless adaptations and reinterpretations, Dracula remains, at his core, a figure that symbolises both the terror of the unknown and the fascination with power and immortality. As a global icon, Dracula embodies the tension between life and death, desire and fear, and the eternal struggle between good and evil. His story continues to captivate audiences around the world, making him one of the most enduring and influential characters in modern culture. The cultural significance of Dracula is undeniable, and his legacy, rooted in both fact and fiction, ensures that he will continue to haunt the imaginations of people for generations to come. The modern concept of vampirism owes much of its origins to Vlad the Impaler and the enduring legend of Dracula. Though the vampire myth had existed in various forms across different cultures for centuries, it was the story of Vlad, combined with Bram Stoker's Dracula, that solidified the modern image of the vampire as both a fearsome predator and a tragic anti-hero. In contemporary vampire fiction, the character of Dracula has evolved from a monstrous figure into a multifaceted symbol of both allure and danger, representing the deep human desires for immortality, power, and escape from mortality's grasp. Vlad the Impaler's thirst for blood, combined with his brutal reign and the supernatural aspects attributed to him, formed the perfect foundation for the vampire myth as we know it today. The transformation of Vlad into a vampire symbolized the dark side of human ambition, the obsessive desire for eternal life, and the willingness to sacrifice one's humanity in pursuit of that goal. Over time, the figure of the vampire became a mirror for human nature, part predator, part victim, reflecting the complexities of desire, loneliness, and fear. In the 20th and 21st centuries, modern interpretations of vampirism began to explore these complexities, often depicting vampires as creatures caught between their monstrous nature and their yearning for connection, redemption, or even love. Television shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and True Blood, as well as novels like Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, present vampires as characters that are both powerful and vulnerable, forced to confront their immortality while grappling with the moral and emotional implications of their actions. These portrayals have made vampires more relatable and, in some cases, sympathetic figures, blurring the lines between good and evil and challenging traditional notions of heroism and villainy. Despite the romanticization and humanization of vampires in modern media, the core of the vampire myth, its connection to death, fear, and power, remains intact. Vlad's influence on the modern vampire myth is unmistakable. His reputation for cruelty and his connection to darkness serve as a reminder of the terror and fascination that vampires invoke. In some modern depictions, Dracula's thirst for blood is not only literal, but also symbolic of the insatiable desire for control and immortality, reflecting a broader societal fear of death and the unknown. Vampires, much like Vlad, are often portrayed as beings who exist outside the natural order, able to escape death while feeding off others in the process. Their immortality becomes both a gift and a curse, much like Vlad's own seemingly endless power. The modern vampire, influenced by Vlad's bloodthirsty image, has become a character of great cultural significance. They symbolize the ongoing human struggle with mortality, the desire to conquer time and death, and the consequences of embracing power without limits. Yet, these modern vampires are not mere monsters. They're individuals with a deep sense of conflict, often seeking redemption, love, or meaning in their otherwise cursed existence. Through this transformation, the myth of the vampire continues to evolve, but it remains rooted in the story of Vlad the Impaler, whose reign of terror gave birth to a legend that continues to captivate the world. Vlad the Impaler, the man behind the terrifying legend of Dracula, has become a figure so entwined with myth and folklore that separating fact from fiction is nearly impossible. The reality of his life and reign, characterized by cruelty and violence, has been distorted over the centuries, blending seamlessly with the supernatural stories that now define his legacy. What remains of Vlad the Impaler is not just the bloodshed he left behind, but the myth that has grown around him, one that has captivated generations and continues to fascinate the world. In historical records, Vlad was indeed a ruthless ruler, known for his brutal tactics against both foreign invaders and his own nobility. He was a man shaped by the harshness of his time, a period in which survival meant power, and power was often maintained through terror. His impalement of thousands, enemies, traitors, even innocent civilians, was a calculated strategy to instill fear, ensuring that his enemies, both external and internal, would think twice before challenging him. But as history has shown, the line between tyrant and legend is often thin. Over the years, the real Vlad became increasingly overshadowed by the figure of Dracula, the vampire who fed on blood, defied death, and wielded eternal power. The actual details of Vlad's life have been blurred by the monstrous image that has taken root in the cultural imagination, and in many ways the real Vlad has been forgotten, replaced by a mythical creature who can never die. The Dracula that exists today is a figure that transcends his historical counterpart, representing a blend of human and supernatural qualities that have allowed him to remain immortal in the minds of people around the world. While the real Vlad the Impaler was a man born of his time, a ruler who faced constant threats from both the Ottoman Empire and the internal factions of his own kingdom, the vampire Dracula embodies something timeless, an eternal symbol of darkness, fear and desire. The modern image of Dracula, often portrayed as a tragic anti-hero or a figure of seduction, has little to do with the real Vlad. Yet both share a common thread: the pursuit of power and the consequences of that thirst. The supernatural version of Dracula, with his immortal life and unending thirst for blood, is a stark contrast to the historical figure of Vlad, whose death marked the end of his reign and his violent rule. However, this supernatural transformation has allowed the figure of Dracula to endure long after Vlad's death, creating a paradox. The man who died centuries ago lives on as a creature beyond time. The figure of Dracula, with his vast influence in literature, film and pop culture, continues to captivate. Yet the real Vlad remains a distant, nearly forgotten shadow, his actions reduced to mere whispers in the grand myth of the vampire. The modern fascination with Dracula, though rooted in the stories of Vlad, has ultimately overshadowed the man himself. What remains of Vlad the Impaler is not just the historical accounts of his reign, but the monstrous legacy that has come to symbolize the eternal fear of the unknown and the insatiable hunger for power. Vlad the Impaler's life and actions will never be fully disentangled from the vampire myth, and in a way, this fusion of the real and the imaginary has ensured that Vlad will live on, forever bound to the darkness he once created. The story of Vlad the Impaler and his transformation into Count Dracula is a tale woven from both historical fact and the richest fabric of myth. Yet, as the centuries have passed, the line between fact and fiction has become increasingly blurred, leaving us to question what of the story is true and what is pure invention. Was Vlad a brutal tyrant whose cruelty birthed the legend of a vampire? Or was Dracula a completely fictional creation, born solely from the imagination of Bram Stoker? The historical Vlad, a real figure from the 15th century, certainly left a legacy of terror, his reign marked by violent military campaigns and the notorious impaling of enemies. His brutality is well documented in both Eastern European chronicles and the records of those who lived under his rule. But the image of Vlad the Impaler as the bloodthirsty, immortal vampire is a much later creation, one that emerged through folklore and most notably through Stoker's Dracula. The challenge of separating fact from fiction lies in the evolution of Vlad's story. As stories of his cruelty spread, they became more sensationalized, and over time, his real-life act of violence transformed into something more sinister. It's within these whispers of fear and fascination that the myth of Dracula was born. The real Vlad, who ruled Wallachia with an iron fist, became the perfect template for the vampire archetype. However, Stoker's Dracula is not a direct retelling of Vlad's life. It's an interpretation, a fictionalization of an idea rooted in the terror that Vlad evoked. In Stoker's novel, Dracula is a creature of the night, a being that transcends death, drawing on the fears of immortality and uncontrollable power. While Stoker borrowed the name and certain aspects of Vlad's character, Dracula, as we know him today, is far more than a historical figure. He's a symbol of darkness, desire, and death itself. Over time, the vampire Dracula has taken on a life of his own, existing in countless films, books, and cultural references. Yet the question remains, how much of this legacy is tied to the real Vlad, and how much of it is pure invention? In the end, the mystery is perhaps the very point. The transformation of Vlad into Dracula represents the ways in which stories evolve and become myths, how historical figures are shaped by collective imagination into something larger than life. The real Vlad the Impaler may have died in the 15th century, but through the lens of folklore and Stoker's novel, he has become something immortal, something far beyond human understanding. The mystery of what is fact and what is fiction may never be fully answered, but it is this very ambiguity that has allowed the Dracula legend to endure. Vlad, once a tyrant, became a creature of myth, a symbol of the horrors of power, immortality, and blood, forever blurring the lines between history and fiction. The legend of Dracula, shaped by centuries of storytelling, continues to captivate us, reminding us of the dark forces that lurk in the shadows of both the real world and the world of our darkest fantasies. Vlad the Impaler's name is forever linked to one of the most terrifying myths in human history. But the truth about him, entwined with darkness and myth, still leaves us wondering, where does the line between legend and reality truly lie? As we continue to explore the untold histories that shaped our nightmares, remember, sometimes the monsters we fear are born from the shadows of our past. Stay curious and join us again for the next chapter in the mysteries of history.